Justice Department's investigation into the Capitol riot and former President Trump's possible role in it. The DOJ is questioning witnesses about Mr. Trump's actions in the lead-up to that riot. It's not yet clear if he is the target of this investigation or if prosecutors are just asking questions related to him. For more on this, Devlin Barrett joins me now. He's a reporter focusing on national security and law enforcement for the Washington Post. And yes, it's a very big Washington Post day here on Red and Blue. So Devlin, great. You are one of the reporters. I believe there were three. Yes, one of the three on the byline who broke this story. Is this a clearest indication, as your reporting indicates, that prosecutors are looking at former President Trump not just as someone who was in and around this, but central to a possible criminal charge?
So I think the easiest way to explain it is, remember that part of this investigation has been about why were there these efforts to substitute fake electors for the actual certified vote results for the states, right? And the president had a number of meetings at that time with his lawyers as they worked on that strategy. And it's important as a minimum threshold issue to understand what were his lawyers' instructions? What instructions did Trump give to his people as they went and pursued those efforts? Because remember, what the federal prosecutors are trying to figure out is, were there crimes of fraud committed in the course of those efforts? And obviously, if you're trying to answer that question, one of the things you need to know is the people you're looking at, what were their instructions? And so as a base level, I don't think it's right to talk about Trump as a target of the investigation, certainly not at this stage. But I do think what's important about what we know now is that they are looking squarely at what Trump told to people. And what Trump told to people is an important element of understanding if there should be indictments in the future.
A really important distinction. I'm glad you made that. You report the Department of Justice now has phone records from Trump administration officials, including former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Now, Meadows initially cooperated with the House Select Committee and then backed away. How critical is Meadows to this process?
I think it's important for two reasons. One, obviously, Mark Meadows is, as the Chief of Staff, kind of a gatekeeper to President Trump. Two, I think it's important because it shows, we reported that these phone records were acquired by the Department of Justice back in April, which means that for a long period of time in which people have, in some quarters, been challenging the Justice Department to do more and be more aggressive and look at the Trump White House and look at Trump's inner circle, in fact, they were already doing that. So that's one. Two, I think it's important because obviously, if you're trying to understand the president's chief of staff communications, you are then really at the heart of White House operations, right? And that just shows the significance and the intensity of this investigation.
And Devlin, I want to ask you this, because some people have said in defense of former President Trump, well, he was fully within his powers to ask questions and to look into these allegations of potential voter fraud. But as I hear you, and as I've watched this very closely, it appears that this has gone to his state of mind. And was he an active participant in things that could later be charged or construed as either trying to subvert an official meeting of Congress or the election herself, or create some sort of fraud prosecution? Am I right on that?
I think that's basically right. The way I explained it to someone else recently was, look, what if the president's conversations in these meetings, which are being examined by federal prosecutors, what if the president is saying in those meetings, I still want to be president. I should still be president. Why can't I still be president? There's not a lot of legal liability there. What if, however, there were statements to the effect of, do what it takes to make me president still. Do whatever you have to do to keep me in the White House. That would have much different implications, right? Now, I'm not saying those two statements were said, but I'm saying that is why it's important for federal prosecutors to ask the question and understand what were these people told to do by their boss.
Right. And there's been a lot of conversation, and hope you can clear this up. The January 6th Select Committee has sort of its process. The Department of Justice has its process, as you just laid out a minute ago. There were those saying, well, what's the Department of Justice doing? Clearly it was doing things way back in April. How would you say these two things compare or track or parallel one another?
I think one is obviously the biggest important distinction here is one is obviously very public, and the other is obviously very private. It's almost like a submarine, and you can only see the periscope, and you don't know the shape or the size of the submarine. Well, what's happened with our reporting and some of the other things that have happened in the last month is part of that submarine is now above the waterline, and you can see some parts of it. You can understand a little better what it's doing. But at the same time, the evidence in these hearings is not meaningful evidence for the purpose of a criminal prosecution. I think, to be honest, sometimes the lawmakers themselves try to suggest it is. In my experience, no prosecutor wants to just sort of take evidence from a congressional committee and then try to convince a jury that evidence should be, evidence worthy of a conviction. Prosecutors want to do this work on their own, in their own grand juries and in their own FBI interviews. And so they are very, very separate and very different. Obviously, they overlap. And in Mark Meadows is a good example. Some of the witnesses will be the same, but they are very different entities.
Real quickly, you've also been reporting on grand jury subpoenas for 2 Arizona state lawmakers. What's the importance there?
So the importance is a couple things. But real quick, it's basically that we can see now the degree to which federal prosecutors are trying to gather all the communications with these fake elector efforts, particularly as it relates to folks like Rudy Giuliani, like John Eastman, another lawyer who worked on this. And that's really important because you start to understand, again, that if you think of it as the investigation as a submarine, the shape and the size of the thing. And it's pretty big.
Devlin Barrett, The Washington Post. We thank you.
Thank you.